My name is Kelly Trudell. Good morning. My name is Kelly Trudell. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Sheehan Finney, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody this morning to our webinar on employee vaccine mandates. Jim Reedy, co-chair of our employment law group here at Sheehan Finney, will guide us through the recent mandate issued by President Biden. Before we get started, please know that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our website later today. So if you missed it, if you'd like to share it with colleagues or friends, please do so. Also on our website is a recent client alert that was issued by Jim Reedy and Mark Ventola, the other co-chair of the group. Similar breakdown of what this vaccine mandate involves is listed there. This program is approved for SHRM credits. The code is listed on the last slide of the program. So you will not miss it. It is there, and it will be also included of the recording posted on our website. Lastly, we really encourage you to post questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And Jim will do his best to address as many questions as possible, but as always, you know how to reach Jim via email. At this point, I'd like to turn the reins over to Jim and let him take you through his presentation.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. And I was just thinking this morning, the evolution of the virus, the evolution of the law, vaccine mandates. It's like New England weather or the fate of the Red Sox. It can change overnight, and that's basically what has happened. And the reason why we're doing this presentation this morning. We had originally planned as a part of this presentation to talk about employer-driven mandates. But now, of course, that all changed last week with President Biden's announcement of the path out of the pandemic. But before I get started, as Kelly was doing some housekeeping, I was reminded that next month, this is the New Hampshire Tech Alliance HR Exchange. You do not have to be a member of a tech company. It's open to all employers. There's no charge for this. Before the pandemic, we all met in person, and for this fall, we're continuing our virtual programs. We're hoping that January and beyond in 2022, we're back in person. But in the meantime, it's virtual, and we're glad you're here. Kelly was telling me this morning, or Liz Tesic was telling me this morning, that we have over 500 people registered. So that's terrific. And we certainly could not accommodate 500 people in our conference center. So, and that's a lot of donuts and coffee. So we do this once a month. This is the Tech Exchange, the HR Exchange. Next month, October 13th, I'm pleased to announce that we're going to talk about recruiting and retaining talent in turbulent times. That's quite an alliteration. That's October 13th. That's a Wednesday, and it's also at 8 a.m. And we're going to be joined by Dave Chulo from HR Power Hour and CMA Associates. So we look forward to that. And the schedule of these events, by the way, is on Sheehan Finney's website, again, once a month. But today we're going to talk about that hot topic of vaccines and the employer mandate and how things have changed really in the last week. And with that, just like someone's gown at a Met Gala gets everyone's attention, let's get to the substance as opposed to the fluff, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And let's get to what we know so far. Now, that being said, there's a lot we don't know yet, because, again, the president just announced these executive orders on September 9th. And he has charged OSHA in large part with developing rules that could be anywhere from 30, 60, 90 days before we see the rules. It will likely be sooner. But that's what we're looking at. So there's a lot we don't know because the rules haven't come out yet. But what we do know comes from the president's speech last week and from other guidance coming from the White House and so on, and things that we've been able to extract from agencies like the EEOC and so on. So in our agenda today, we're going to cover just a quick overview of the infection rates, both locally and nationally. And why are we saying that? Well, that's the driver. That's the driver behind why the federal government is looking at a vaccine mandate and why employers before that were considering it. And we're going to look at what has changed with President Biden's announcement. we're going to look at some of the legal issues, the federal authority for the mandate, some exemptions and objections that may be asserted by employees, the possibility of testing and how that is going to be handled, whether there are any tax credits like there was under the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, reasonable accommodation analysis, which of course is something near and dear to HR professionals, and OSHA's authority and the timing of the projected enforcement of the path out of the pandemic and other workplace considerations and so on. And as Kelly said, we're going to basically go through these materials, but we're going to leave plenty of time for questions. And so do please post them in the Q&A section. I'll get to as many as I can. And as Kelly said, you can always find me here at She and Finney. So just trying to advance my slide here. Okay, so as we're looking at this, so what's the reason for the change and the alarm that's been happening with regard to the virus? Well, we've all heard about Delta, Delta Plus, I think Lambda, Mu are the, I mean, it's almost like naming hurricanes or sororities and fraternities, but the variants could have been expected because it's a virus and viruses mutate as they look to find hosts or as they just, because they're living organisms and they do look to mutate. And it's exactly what has happened here. And for the most part, in the early days of the vaccine, meaning from December to say June, July, the vaccines were very effective with regard to COVID as it was first introduced to the US. And the question is whether or not they continue to be effective with regard to their variants. Now, the three approved Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer vaccines, the reports are they still are effective with regard to Delta and Delta Plus, but perhaps not as effective. And the question is whether it's because of the vaccine and how it, or because of the virus, or because over time, the vaccine is not as effective. And that remains to be seen. But for now, and that's why there's discussion about booster shots. But for now, the issue was that you think back in May when CDC rolled out and said that mask mandates were not necessary. The mask wasn't necessary anymore for those who were vaccinated. And we all gladly took off our masks and got back to what we thought was going to be May, June, July, a return to near normal. But sometime in late July, early August, the infection numbers seemed to spike a bit and increase, causing some alarm, mostly in other parts of the country beyond New England, but now it's in New England as well. At the same time, as of July, there was a goal of 70% of Americans that were eligible for the vaccine to get it. And sadly, that was missed. That is not an indictment of the former federal administration or the current occupant of the White House. It just is the reality of the infrastructure is there. And the question is whether or not people wanted to get the vaccine. Those who were eligible wanted to get the vaccine. And so at the same time, again, the trajectory was the virus was increasing, whether it was because of the variants or it was because of the stubborn nature of those that chose not to get or had not yet had access to the vaccine. So again, while vaccinations among adults have increased, and that it has been steadily increasing, it still fell short of national goals. And so not wanting to return to the shutdowns of last year, and nobody wants to return to that, that employers started to ask whether they could require their employees to get the vaccine. And that's something that we were working on all summer. And I mean, not just healthcare employers, but non-healthcare employers, meaning everything from white collar environments to manufacturing facilities to others, asking, is that something they could do? And the short answer, as provided from our friends at EEOC, was yes. The short answer is yes. EEOC came out with guidance around the same time that the vaccines were introduced last December, and then again this spring, and they basically said the same thing, which was, yes, an employer could mandate the vaccine if it is job-related and consistent with business necessity. Now, what does that mean? Well, they didn't provide a lot of examples, and they certainly didn't say it was only unique to certain types of environments like hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, first responders, and so on. They said job-related and consistent with business necessity, and basically left that up to the employers to decide. However, they also said if you do have the mandate, you have to have certain exemptions, and those exemptions would be reasonable accommodation if someone has a medical condition that would prevent them from getting the vaccine, supported by a doctor's note or a healthcare provider note, sufficient for the employer to accept. And then I think one that's a bit more vexing or challenging is someone based upon their sincerely held religious belief. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because nobody wants to get into the business of, let alone talking about someone's medical history, talking about their religious beliefs and how sincere they are. And that was and continues to be a problem for employers, and will continue to be with the Biden mandate if indeed that survives legal challenges. So this is what was queued up in July and August and into early September, and then came the President Biden's announcement, path out of the pandemic. So there are a couple of executive orders, but there's an executive order that applies to federal government employees, federal contractors, that basically says that they are it is mandated that they have to be fully vaccinated. I believe it's the middle of November, fully vaccinated. And compared to the private sector, where there can be an opt-out for testing, meaning if you don't get the vaccine, you're tested once a week and you wear PPE and so on, similar to what was the case before the mandate. There is no opt-out for testing for federal employees and federal contractors, and that's very interesting. Now, the distinction is under the path out of the pandemic, the order says that, the mandate rather says that if private employers have more than 100 employees, they too have to require vaccination for their employees. However, their employees can opt out by testing once a week. And then there are some questions that arise as to who pays for the testing. What we know at this point is that the time taken to get the vaccine is considered hours worked under federal wage laws. And if someone is recovering from side effects, that too is considered to be paid time off. We'll talk about that in a minute. But again, under the order, OSHA, the health and safety wing of the U.S. Department of Labor, is to establish temporary rules and commence enforcement. And no date and time was set for that, but that has been set in motion at this point, and we're waiting for additional information as they establish the rules. So predictably, because that's the environment we live in these days, where we're so balkanized or so polarized politically, almost immediately, the Republican National Committee, as many as 17 or 18 states, and some large employers threatened to sue. And short of lawsuits, CEOs from several major corporations, including but not limited to Coca-Cola, Kellogg, Campbell Soup, and so on, have asked the president to clarify several issues. And I'm going to talk about those because those come up in our common questions that have been raised with this mandate. But the legal challenges are the mandate itself is unconstitutional, that the president didn't have the authority to basically direct private employers to require the vaccine of their employees. There's no precedent or authority for it, both from the executive branch or from the president or the executive branch. It's overbroad, that it leaps beyond what states were doing or what private employers could do. And there was no acknowledgement of, and I think this is a lesser challenge, of natural immunity or COVID survivors with antibodies, meaning that if someone is naturally immune or had COVID and they've got the antibodies, that's the Rand Paul argument, that they shouldn't then also receive the vaccine on top of it. They're already prevented from, their bodies have rejected or could reject the virus. I don't know how strong that last challenge is going to be, but the others have to seem some level of merit. Again, and this was the case before President Biden's mandate or proposed mandate, there was no precedent for a federal mandate of a vaccine. And the president actually acknowledged this earlier this year when he encouraged states to provide incentives for employers rather, to get their employees to get vaccinated. So either from the state or from employers to increase the vaccination levels to get up to hopefully herd immunity of 70, 80% vaccinated. In OSHA's guidance in 2014, they had a pandemic guide, and it simply mentioned offering or encouraging vaccination to reduce the risk of infection. And EEOC, in its position over the years, we're talking about flu, H1N1, SARS, and so on, said that a vaccine may be necessary in certain jobs. And I think that what they're saying in their guidance this last December and again recently is saying the same thing. It may be necessary in some jobs, but there should also be an opt-out from medical and religious beliefs. They are consistent in that regard. I'm having a little trouble advancing slides here, so just bear with me. There we go. Can I blame that on COVID too? So that was then, this is now. And again, the COVID variant infections continue to be on the rise. I was looking at statistics yesterday, and we're basically at where we were in November of last year for purposes of infections. And that's not a good trajectory or good statistic to be in. The unvaccinated remain approximately 1/3 of all eligible Americans. Between 80 and 100 million Americans are unvaccinated. And again, there are concerns about even more variants coming along. So even if the federal government, if there's a challenge that's successful with regard to the federal government, can state governments mandate a vaccine? Well, under New Hampshire law, we already know if you're in a healthcare environment, you know that healthcare workers in hospitals, adult daycare facilities, residential care, long-term care facilities, and so on, can be required to receive a flu shot every year and present immunization records, and it's basically childhood immunization records, but basically that they have MMR, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, and Hep C. That's a part of our state law. But there are still exemptions from those immunizations, and those are medical and religious reasons. But even in that regard, the question is, can the person still perform his or her job with or without that reasonable accommodation? Meaning, if you have a medical reason as why you couldn't get the Hep C, well, then you probably are not going to be working in an environment where there's a scalpel cut or an issue with a needle where you could basically infect a patient. So, and during the flu, the question is whether or not, you can wear your PPE and work in a clinical area or not, and so on. So, and we've had those cases over the years. Very interesting. This summer, the governor signed into law a New Hampshire medical freedom law, which basically said that places of public accommodation could not require a vaccine in order for individuals to gain access to those facilities for purposes of access to facility benefits or services from those facilities. So does that state law stand in opposition to the federal law? We don't know. But that state law, there's not a lot of legislative history in that regard, and there are no regulations in that regard. And that has caused some confusion locally, even before the president's mandate. What about other states? Well, for folks that are listening in today, you may have operations in other states, not just Massachusetts, but well beyond. And the question is whether or not there were already in place state mandates or even local mandates with regard to vaccination, similar to what we have here in New Hampshire with regard to certain types of facilities. And that's certainly something that you should have looked at already. And I'm sure many of you have. But again, this is a sort of a perfect storm of the virus rising, the vaccinations not being where we want them to be for purposes of herd immunity, the variants happening at the same time, and then the confusion between local, state, and federal lawmakers. So the path out of the pandemic, that is again, the president's announcement last week. The focus is on the 80 to 100 million unvaccinated. There's some discussion as to whether or not it was to protect the vaccinated, truly to protect everyone. But the focus is on the those that are unvaccinated, to get them vaccinated to the extent possible. Again, most federal employees and contractors involved in this, and there's going to be more information coming out on that. But again, there's no opt-out testing for them as there had been in the past or proposed in the past. Private sector employers with 100 or more employees, the option is to test out if you're not getting if you are exempt because of religious or medical reasons, or potentially you refuse to get the vaccine. Now, that's something that needs to be clarified too, as to whether or not those that simply refuse for philosophical or other reasons not to get the vaccine, whether or not they should get the opt-out as well for purposes of testing. And of course, the question is, in addition to who pays for the testing and the time to take the testing, is the paid time off for the individual to get vaccinated, should they choose to get vaccinated, and recover from any side effects. There, under the FFCRA, as it was extended last year into this year on a voluntary basis, employers could get a tax credit for that emergency sick leave for employees getting the vaccine and recovering from the vaccine. That has not been a part of the president's order yet for purposes of tax credits for employers. It just simply says that it's paid time off. So beyond what the employer already has, presumably, to get the vaccine and to perhaps to recover from any side effects. And again, the authority for this, for the regulations, the rules rather, and the enforcement come under the emergency temporary standards under OSHA. And the standard for that is, in order for OSHA to issue an ETS, there has to be it's a two-prong analysis. Employees need to be exposed to grave danger from a hazard, and the ETS is necessary to protect those employees from that danger. The ETS can remain in effect once announced for about 6 months. At that point, it must move to permanent rule status, which then goes through a formal rulemaking comment and notice period, and that's a bit more involved, of course. Again, there is no effective date for the current ETS rule. It hasn't come out yet, but we expect to see it within the next 30, 60, 90 days. So what will result from those legal challenges that have been proposed that you hear about on CNN, Fox News, or otherwise? It's too soon to tell. And that sounds like a lawyer's response, but it is true. It is too soon to tell. In the past, if we can look at some sort of precedent here, prior to COVID-19, healthcare ETS issues with OSHA were either fully vacated or stayed in at least 4 different court cases. However, more recently, courts have consistently upheld employer mandates over the last 6 months, whether we're talking about Mercy Hospital in Texas or the University of Indiana, and so on. And that is pretty consistent, where the courts have consistently upheld the legality of employer vaccine mandates. So while we're waiting for the ETS to come out, while we're waiting for these legal challenges to shake out, the question is, can employers still mandate the vaccine? Because a lot of employers out there, and folks listening today, already put in motion vaccine mandates. And the answer is yes, you can. Now let's go back again, just a step back to last December. When the FDA issued their emergency use authorization for the first vaccine, Pfizer, it received that temporary approval, as we know. And then after that, the FDA, shortly after that, approved, again, under emergency use authorization, Moderna, and then followed that Johnson & Johnson. The FDA required, as a part of that EUA, that employees be informed that they have the option to accept or refuse the vaccine. But the EUA did not address the fact that there may be employment consequences if an employee refuses to get vaccinated or can't get vaccinated because of the exceptions the EEOC talks about for purposes of religious or medical reasons. And that comes down to a reasonable accommodation analysis. EEOC has been, again, consistent in this regard. And what they say is a mandate is possible if it is job related and you would go to the specific job and consistent with the employer's business necessity. And they updated again that guidance in the spring and said effectively the same thing. But again, they did not specify the workplaces where vaccines could be required. That means, in other words, we initially thought that it was going to be hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living facilities, healthcare facilities, and related organizations. But EEOC didn't say that, and therefore other employers could mandate that their employees get the vaccine as long as they followed the EEOC guidance. So I'll jump to that. I'm going to go back to that in a second. But again, in the meantime, with about 3/4 of eligible Americans having received at least one shot, but the breakthroughs and the possibility of boosters, many employers in non-healthcare settings considered implementing a vaccine mandate on their own. And again, those were in process before the president's announcement. And one of the things that we saw for those that are listening today that have college-age students, that many colleges, universities, several here in New England, I think Harvard, BU, Colby-Sawyer College most recently, and there are several others, have said that students, faculty, and staff must be vaccinated before they return to campus, and that is a condition of returning to campus. Exemptions were allowed for medical and religious reasons, but they're subject to heightened scrutiny. And some schools have actually recently unenrolled unvaccinated students. I think at the University of Virginia, unenrolled almost 300 students a week before classes were to begin because they were not vaccinated. We went through a year of COVID, of course, where there was remote learning. There was segregation on college campuses. There was masking. There was issues with regard to housing and meal plans and activities and so on. And a recent survey of college presidents suggests that the mandates were preferred to mask policies, to segregated facilities, to remote learning options, and so on. They just had effectively enough of that. And also they had heard from parents and students that they wanted to be back on campus. So some would argue it was a sort of a draconian measure to go to fully vaccinated without considering other options, but that's where a lot of schools are now. Again, EEOC has twice confirmed that employer mandates are indeed possible. And more recently, the U.S. Justice Department in, I think it was July of this year, based on several of the challenges, some of the ones I mentioned, Mercy Hospital, University of Indiana, and so on, said that vaccine mandates are not illegal. And again, several courts have lined up and said exactly the same thing. So EEOC's guidance on vaccination makes it clear that an employee's refusal to get the vaccine or request for an exemption, rather, can be based on medical reasons or sincerely held religious beliefs. And if that is the case, and if it's approved by the employer should also look at reasonable accommodations. And said, that let's go back to the level of inquiry, because that's the obvious question that comes up from a lot of employers that has been the case since last December. Well, can we ask if you're vaccinated? And the answer is yes, you can ask employees. So a lot of the folks that are listening today have already surveyed their workplaces through SurveyMonkey, through word of mouth, through group meetings and so on. Are you vaccinated? And the answer is yes, you can ask that question. Can you discipline an employee who refuses to respond to that question? Yes, you can, because that's failure to cooperate, and it's an important safety standard. Could you ask to see proof of vaccination? And the answer is from EEOC, yes, you can. But the EEOC then cautions you have to be very careful in that regard. You don't elicit more information that is necessary about the person's mental or physical impairments, current healthcare status, and I would go beyond that to talk about religious beliefs. That is not necessary, not relevant to any accommodation discussion. Basically, it's a third rail. You want to be careful about. Let's focus on the person's job. They say they've got this and that we've approved a medical exemption or religious exemption, and then, okay, can they still perform the essential functions of their job with this accommodation or with some other accommodation related to that? And that's it. You don't jump into, so tell me why you're not vaccinated. Do you have some sort of hidden health issue that we don't know about that you haven't disclosed? How about your family? Can we talk about that and what their health conditions are? On a scale of 1 to 10, how religious are you? Well, no, you don't get to those issues. You just get to, if you've adopted the proof given of the medical or religious exemption, and we'll talk about that a little more in a second, then you move on to, okay, can this person still perform their job with or without this accommodation? It's interesting. So EEOC gives a little bit of guidance in that regard. And this is employees who refuse to get the vaccine, again, based upon the religious or medical exception, may be, and the reasonable accommodations may be, they're relieved from their duty, their job itself, they're transferred, they're required to work remotely. But EEOC then goes on to say this: employers cannot retaliate against an employee for refusing to get the vaccine. Now, what immediately comes to mind? But now, with the mandate that's come out from either from employers or from the president's mandate, can we fire someone who doesn't get the vaccine? And if it's a mandated vaccine, I think the answer is yes, you can. But as we'll talk about in a minute, we think that termination should be your last resort. You should look at other options first. And also, if you've got it in a union environment, mandating the vaccine could be the subject of collective bargaining because it gets to terms and conditions of employment. And the other important thing for HR professionals, and you all know this, is that vaccination records and related records, and we're talking about perhaps even testing, in fact, certainly including testing, should be considered a confidential medical record under the ADA, which is segregated from other records and prying eyes, and further only disclosed on a need-to-know basis. So again, that question is, wait, so can we terminate the unvaccinated employee? Again, the answer is yes, but it should be the last resort. Let's go back to the reasonable accommodation analysis. Vaccinations, EEOC says vaccinations are not medical exams under the ADA, but they still have to be, again, and this is going to be sing-songy, but it's still true, and you have to focus on this. They must be job-related, consistent with business necessity, or justified by a direct threat. And the inquiries are no more intrusive than necessary. You focus on the job, you focus on the reasonable accommodation, so on. And we're going to talk about direct threat, an important point too, because if it's a direct threat, you cannot have a reasonable accommodation. So in talking about reasonable accommodations, when the employee is exempt from getting the vaccine, employers consider the reasonable accommodations under Title VII, religious accommodations, or under the ADA, medical or disability accommodations. Let's talk about religious for a second, because of course, next to politics, that's such a topic that can end any dinner time conversation. We're not comfortable talking about that. And I think I wouldn't necessarily say that's a New England thing, but that is something that is very difficult to talk about with other people because it's a private matter. So for purposes of, I want to be exempt from the vaccine because of my sincerely held religious belief. The employer can ask you, what is that? It has to be a sincerely held religious belief, not someone who I generally believe in some deity. I believe in this spirit or that. I think it is consistent with the Bible, which I've never read, or and so on. In other words, it can't be sincerely held non-religious beliefs, which is I believe in natural order. I believe in science. I believe in that my body's immune system can take care of these things, or I'm opposed to vaccines because the origin of the vaccine may come from fetal tissue, or it may, that somehow that Bill Gates has implanted his DNA in us, that I've discovered this on the dark web and so on. No, it has to be a sincerely held religious belief, and it should come from. And the early guidance on this was that the employee should identify what his or her specific religious beliefs are and how they conflict with the vaccine requirement. And you can identify a religion, but it doesn't have to be a formal religion. It basically has to be, these are my religious beliefs, and this is the foundation for them. And that's the level of inquiry. In other words, the early days, we talked about getting a pastor, a priest, a minister, a rabbi, a shaman, whomever, to certify, yes, this person is a member of our congregation, and these are our sincerely held beliefs. I've had other employers actually look at church websites to see if there's anything about vaccines and so on, or dig it even deeper to church doctrine and so on. Looking at church doctrine, whether we're talking about Christian Scientists or Seventh-day Adventists or Roman Catholics or Orthodox Jews and so on, looking at that as to whether or not there's a history or there's a doctrine or a proclamation from the church with regard to the vaccine or vaccines in general, or medical intervention in general. Can you look at that? You can, but the caution is beyond that, the person doesn't have to be a part of and a regular follower of the religion. It could be just simply, I've adopted this and this is my belief. That makes it really difficult for employers. So the employer is obligated under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to reasonably accommodate the employee's sincerely held religious belief, unless doing so would result in undue hardship. Now I'm going to go back for a second. So again, the person says, I identify as a, blank, whether it's an evangelical Christian or a member of this church or this religion or that religion. And as a result of that, this is what I believe. Can you look at that religion and say, well, there's nothing in that religion that is opposed to vaccine? In fact, there's evidence that from those church leaders that, again, they agree that you can have a vaccination. Yes, you can look at that. But that isn't, if the person says, yes, I'm a member of this church, however, I also believe this. The question is whether that is a sincerely held religious belief, or that is really just effectively a personal, medical, philosophical reasons that it really has nothing to do with religious beliefs. But assuming you adopt or accept the religious accommodation, you are to reasonably accommodate that person, unless doing so would represent an undue hardship for the employer. And the important thing to point out there is the undue hardship analysis for religious accommodation is different than the ADA. It's a lesser standard. It has to be it's more than a minimal burden, and it has to be something significant. The employee, again, doesn't have to be a part of a formal religious group, but the objection cannot be personal, political, philosophical, or the like. So I think that the closing out the thought with regard to religious is, yes, the person has to make a statement. Could that statement be under pains and penalty of perjury, with a notary signing off? Sure, you could do that. And it is acknowledgement that having the person state, these are my, again, sincerely held beliefs. Are they subject to testing? Yes. I had an example recently where the person said, I object on the basis of, well, it turned out to be exactly the same as about several other employees from the same workplace. Turns out one was either copying the paper of another, or there are packages on the internet right now that an employee can, buy for, it sounds like a late night commercial, between $40 and $60 to get what is supposed to be an ironclad package that will support someone's exemption for religious reasons. If you see these carbon copy responses, that can't necessarily be a sincerely held belief, because they've basically taken something off the internet or from a coworker. So you can ask a bit more information and so on. Just tread lightly, and you're not going to have the person do a multiple choice test on their religion and so on. But you can also ask, and we had this recently where someone had received other vaccines. Well, if you received other vaccines, why is this a problem? And if they say, well, it's because of, let's say it's the problem with abortion and fetal tissue. Well, that's not for all of the vaccines. That's only for one of the vaccines. So there is that back and forth with the employer, and that is something that you can engage in. Again, respectful of the person's wishes, but also the overarching issue for employers is the safety of all. And so your business can hopefully continue to operate. Medical, to me, is a bit more straightforward because the exemption is based upon physical and mental disability, which is a recognized impairment. And that if you go to the ADA analysis, a physical and mental impairment that significantly interferes with a major life activity, and that's a disability. But you could have other medical reasons that don't necessarily rise to the level of disability. And if that is accepted and you've got medical proof from a healthcare provider that indeed there is this condition that would keep the person from either getting the vaccine in the first instance, or there is a concern that it might, some sort of interaction with other medication or therapies they're receiving could cause adverse health reactions, then you could have a reason for accepting that exemption. But there is no reasonable accommodation. Again, if you accept the exemption, you have to do a reasonable accommodation analysis back and forth with the employee and perhaps their healthcare provider. But there is no reasonable accommodation if there's an undue hardship, meaning both with the religious exemption and with the medical exemption, it represents a direct threat to the employee or coworkers in the workplace. What does that mean? That means that the person is unvaccinated and in the workplace and work in close proximity to others. Do they represent a direct threat to themselves or others if they're not taking the appropriate precautions, PPE and so on? But even then, the differences between a mask and a vaccine is significant for purposes of efficacy in preventing transmission or infection. So what is the undue hardship? Going back to undue hardship before you even get to direct threat, undue hardship for medical reasons, medical disability reasons is, can the person perform his or her job, all the essential functions of his or her job, with or without the reasonable accommodation? It's reasonable unless it's not, and it's not if it represents an undue hardship. And what is an undue hardship? Undue hardship is cost and effect upon the organization. If what the person is proposing, whether it's remote work or hybrid work or segregated work area or additional restrictions, can't travel, additional safety procedures or the like in the workplace, the cost and effect upon the organization. So what we always say is don't necessarily focus on the cost, because if you focus on the cost, the defense would be open up your books and show me all the other things you've spent your money on. Instead, focus on the effect upon the organization. If he or she isn't here, or he or she can't travel, or he or she can't interact in a certain way, does that mean others have to cover for him or her in performing the job? And that is the effect upon the organization. So, but all of that comes from a back and forth with the employee and his or her healthcare provider. That is the interactive process. And then a part of the interactive process, you do look at direct threat. Direct threat is individualized, and it basically looks at a couple of factors, which would be the duration of the risk, the nature and the severity of the potential harm to the employee or to coworkers, the likelihood that the potential harm could occur, and and how imminent the threat is. And that would really principally be close proximity to others, and you cannot effectively, with mask or otherwise, prevent transmission or infection. And that's, I would say, direct threat is probably a pretty limited analysis because of the many opportunities for alternative work arrangements. So, and we've been through that, but and it's, if there's no way to provide a reasonable accommodation, then you've got direct threat. But again, I think that's limited. Other issues to consider would be consider if the CDC or OSHA guidelines, infection control policies, and so on, in making the decision whether a reasonable accommodation is possible. So CDC guidelines that we know evolved over the last year for everything from no mask to potentially double mask, and then no mask again. And then OSHA was following them again. OSHA was actually caught flat-footed in May when EEOC went to no mask for the vaccinated, and OSHA had to catch up. And then again, you can look at direct threat, especially with regard to the OSHA guidelines. So OSHA guidelines under the general safety rule, whether or not there's a hazard in the workplace and what you can do to remove that hazard. Again, if you're dealing with a union environment, you may have a situation where you have to bargain on some of the issues with regard to your safety policies, and in particular with regard to your mask mandate or your vaccine mandate. I mean, some would argue, and me included, that some of that could certainly be included under your management rights clause under a collective bargaining agreement. But if you're dealing with terms and conditions of employment, whether you're talking about alternative work shift, split shifts, transfers, and so on, you're probably going to have to bargain that with the union. HIPAA is one that's sort of thrown around a lot with regard to these issues, whether the inquiries of whether or not someone is vaccinated or not, providing proof of vaccination, and the testing results and so on, and or even responding to questions, are you vaccinated? I don't have to respond because that's HIPAA protected information. Most employers, to be clear, are not covered by HIPAA in this regard. They're not providing healthcare services to their employees. HIPAA is really focused on the providing of medical services to individuals and protecting that information, that PHI, personal health information. However, you do have some issues that arise in HIPAA, which is employers looking into someone's group health insurance claims to determine if they're vaccinated or not. That's sort of the end run around the questionnaire. It's probably not a good idea because that could violate HIPAA's privacy rule. But the other is going back to the ADA, which overlaps with HIPAA, which would be if you've got confidential medical records that include an employee's PHI, personal health information, you want to protect that and keep that segregated from other personnel files, and it's only disclosed on a need-to-know basis. Then, of course, GINA has to deal with the genetic information basically involving family members and being careful about avoiding digging into too much information with regard to the health information of an employee's family members and so on, and health history. This issue came up in the spring of last year before we went to mandates or considered mandates, and that would be, can employers provide incentives for employees to get vaccinated? Again, the president talked about that in the spring as well, when he recognized that or stated that the federal government did not have the authority to impose a mandate at that point. He encouraged states and employers to provide incentives. Can that be done? The answer is yes. If you look back to EEOC guidance on that, back to wellness programs, the answer is yes. And if it is an incentive towards wellness and it's not a penalty for someone who, and again, the EEOC guidance would be someone who is a smoker or has a certain body mass index or has diabetes or other health conditions and so on, and having to pay higher premiums because of that, those behaviors or habits. That's not what this is talking about. I mean, EEOC said you could have weight loss clinics, you could have incentives for smoke enders and so on, and with that get certain credits towards health insurance premiums. That's fine. So the question that comes up with regard to incentives with regard to the vaccine is, could that be challenged by those who couldn't get the vaccine, so they can't get the incentive because of religious or medical reasons? And early indications are that that's really not a penalty for those individuals because they're exempt from getting the vaccine, so not penalized because of their religious or medical reasons. It's just there are incentives for those who are eligible to get the vaccine who indeed get those. Alternatives to the vaccine, and this is something that's been talked about, again, if the president's mandate doesn't go through, if employers don't pursue mandates, they could consider, moving employee to a new job or space and testing. And the question always is who pays. But under New Hampshire law, if you have a medical test and it's required in the workplace, the employer pays. Remote work, Sure. But remote work, whether we're talking about during COVID and vaccine related, or we're talking about any reasonable accommodation having nothing to do with COVID or the vaccine, it should be limited and something you could revisit so it isn't in perpetuity. Insisting on new or enhanced PPE and safety procedures, certainly. The N95 mask, changing filters daily and so on. And even then segregating the workplace, not being in close proximity to someone, having that social distancing and so on. And also doing your daily screening for purposes of, in addition to testing, for purposes of if someone is symptomatic, if they've traveled to a hotspot area, if they're in contact with someone who is suspected or confirmed to have COVID and so on. And again, and furlough and leave as possibilities as well. And that could happen with this mandate. You may furlough some employees for a period of time until such time that the crisis passes. But termination, at least our recommendation, should be the last option, used only when the unvaccinated person represents a direct threat to others or there is no reasonable accommodation in their job. Like anything else, while it said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, in the law, consistency is a good thing. And so whether you're talking about the application of your COVID vaccine policies, your opt-out practices, your record keeping, your exemptions and so on, being as consistent as possible. It's an individualized assessment with individual employees, but still consistent in the application of your standards. So let's go back to the President Biden's mandate. There are several unanswered questions, and that is typical, not of this in particular, but any law, regardless of the party that's in the majority at that point. It's always the case. Last year, under the Trump administration, when the FFCRA rolled out, when the CARES Act rolled out, there were a lot of questions with regard to what does this mean? What does that mean? And there were a lot of FAQs that came out from the Department of Labor and so on. And EEOC came out with its guidance and so on. So Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. What matters is when something new comes out, there's always going to be a lot of questions. Okay, what does this mean? And so you have to wait for rules and regulations and perhaps even the decision and court challenges. But here it's, when will the rule be announced and effective? That wasn't said, but it will be effective when the rule is announced because it's an ETS. But we don't know when that will be. 30, 60, 90 days is what the projection is at this point. How will the 100 employees be counted for purposes of private sector employers? Is that FTEs? Is that part-time employees? Is that seasonal employees? Is it similar to the Title VII test or the ADA test, a look back of the current and preceding year, at least 20 weeks in the current or preceding year? Or is it going to be like the FMLA? What's it going to be? And is it going to be like the FMLA, the integrated employer test, meaning we've got operations in this state, in this state, in this state, but they all report into this common place. Is that how it's going to be counted? We don't know. And we wait to see. It will be probably one of the existing standards that's out there, and that's typically what happens, but we'll wait to see. Will employers need to collect proof of vaccination for purposes of the federal mandate? I don't know, but I would assume so. And then, of course, you're going to keep that as a confidential medical record. What type of tests are acceptable? Meaning, if there's going to be testing, are you sending them out to a Walgreens or Rite Aid, a CVS, or are you going to do the rapid test in your workplace? We don't know. We do know that initially they said that there is an infrastructure in place for, again, those pharmacy outlets to have them at cost. So there's no profit. And there will also be a number of free tests available. But the question is whether or not employers can have on-site their own tests. And again, if they do, how are they administered and how is that record kept? Will remote employees be included? I think that's highly unlikely. I think the only reason remote employees would be included, they might be included for purposes of the head count, but whether or not they're going to be required to get the vaccine is a different issue. And it's if they're remote, but they travel, or they're remote, but they come into the workplace once in a while, then perhaps certainly they would be subject to the vaccine requirement. But if they're fully remote, unlikely they would be subject to the vaccine requirement or mandate, but we'll see. what will the deadline be for full vaccination? And for those employers that had already looked at putting in place a vaccine mandate, some said by the middle of September, some did by the middle of October. We know that for federal employees, it's I think it'd be around the 22nd of November. We don't know for purposes of full vaccination. So if it's the J&J vaccine, it's one shot. If it's Pfizer or Moderna, it's two shots, at least 21 days apart. So that's in the planning, but there is no information yet on the full vaccination requirement. And then, of course, hand in glove with that would be how soon before OSHA then engages the engine for purposes of inspections, complaints, and assessment of potential fines. Will workers' comp apply to the vaccine side effects or adverse reactions? That's one that varies from state to state, and that's an issue that's going to come up with long haul COVID. But that's been one that's been state by state, depending upon state law with regard to their workers' comp statute. In New Hampshire, I think there's an attorney general opinion that basically says that unless it can be proven that COVID infection came from the workplace, it's not covered by workers' comp because the nature of the virus, we don't know how it was transmitted or the person was infected. There are as many as 20 states, however, that have modified their state statutes to make workers' comp cover COVID infections that arise out of the workplace. But what about this? If you're required to receive the vaccine and you have a side effect or adverse reaction, could that be covered by workers' comp? I think that's a little bit different because that's receiving the vaccine as opposed to getting the infection, because you know that you received the vaccine at the workplace and so on. Legal defenses, if the unvaccinated employee is terminated, we'll see, because go back to the guidance of EEOC, and even on, the EEOC says that employees cannot be retaliated against for refusing the vaccine. Well, termination would be the ultimate retaliation, right? So don't know, but I think the overarching would be, but it's a federal mandate and the person's not otherwise exempt. The person simply refuses, and the vaccine is job related and consistent with business necessity and also consistent with a federal mandate. So again, I go back to if the person is exempt because of religious or medical reasons, then you would, as a private employer, you would look for the opt-out testing as opposed to termination. Again, you want to look at, though, can the person still, if they're not vaccinated, perform their job and all the essential functions of the job in a safe manner for themselves and for others. And then another issue comes up is unemployment benefits. If someone is terminated for refusing the vaccine, remember in the days of COVID in the last year, if someone lost their job because of COVID, they got unemployment benefits. If they were furloughed, they lost their job. And for a number of reasons related to it. And also if they had COVID and they couldn't work and so on. That's effectively gone away. And the question is now, if the person refuses the vaccine, is that refusing an employer policy? And with that, they know that they could be terminated. That's a real question as to whether or not they can get unemployment benefits. But that could be devastating for those out of work because of, well, again, that's refusing to get the vaccine, not because of the medical or religious reasons. That to me would be no fault of the employee, and therefore they're likely to get unemployment benefits if those exemptions apply. So what do we do now? Well, certainly always stay up to date with CDC and state, the applicable state health department guidance. Create or update your COVID-19 policy for your workplace. And that has evolved over the last year from furloughing employees to being fully remote to being partially remote in a hybrid practice to coming back to work, then perhaps rolling back again to remote work, at least on a part-time basis and so on. But also going back to your screening procedures. I think a lot of employers got a little lax in the last 6 months with regard to their daily screening procedures. And I don't mean just taking temperatures. I mean asking the questions of, do you have these symptoms? Have you been exposed to? And so on. Create the infrastructure. I think this would be wise for employers with 100 or more employees, the infrastructure within their organization for the administration and tracking of administration of the vaccine and tracking of compliance. That means getting the vaccine and also testing. Continue to follow your recommended workplace safety policies. If vaccination is required or encouraged, be careful to avoid improper and irrelevant inquiries. And what that means is really focus on your supervisors, and your supervisors not saying, asking questions about someone's religion or medical reasons as to why they're exempt, and really having that a discussion between HR. And even then, keeping within the bounds of what is an appropriate inquiry. Engage employees in seeking an exemption in the interactive process. That's the back and forth with the employee with regard to their requested exemption and the reasons for it and the supporting information they're going to provide, and whether or not they could still perform the essential functions of the job. That's the back and forth that is required under the ADA, but also under Title VII, that back and forth for religious accommodations. And understand your state laws. Again, New Hampshire law says if it's a medical test that the employer pays for it, but understand your state law if you're in other states as well, whether or not there's any requirement that you pay for it, the employer pays for it. Maintain confidential medical records. Again, that's the testing requirements and the inquiries related to vaccination. And again, to the extent possible, be consistent. And of course, as always, stay tuned because this is going to be, again, rapidly developing. COVID is, as a virus, is here to stay, but also as a effect of life that is affecting the modern workplace in one form or another. It's here, and it's going to be here for a while. So I've got some time. This is exactly how much time I want to spend on the actual presentation. I want to spend more time on responding to your questions, and we've got many. So let's jump in and look at those. All right. If you're considered a federal contractor, but less than 100 employees, does the mandate pertain? Guess what? We don't know yet. Whether it's a determination as to, like you with affirmative action requirements, a certain amount of money in the federal contract makes you subject to certain obligations. We don't know yet if it's all federal contractors, regardless of dollar amount or regardless of number of employees. Early indications are that it's without regard to the number of employees that you have, it's really going to be, are you truly a federal contractor? So that is one where we're looking for additional guidance to come out. There is new guidance that has just come out on that, but it's as I said, it applies to federal contractors and not just the number of employees that they have, but are they a federal contractor? Now the question is, well, that's going to be a dollar amount in the contract over the last year or in total, and that remains to be seen. Next question is, we are a Massachusetts employer with 110 employees in 33 states. Most work remotely with some in sales and working with customers or providing services to customers and vendor sites, but not all. How is the 100 employee mandate calculated? Again, we don't know. I think you can assume that if you're an integrated employer with, again, you've got 110 employees over 33 states, they're all going to be counted. If you're under the same EIN number and so on, and there's some sort of central control coming from headquarters. So I think that's probably what's going to come down here. But the issue then will be for you when you've got people working remotely, that, truly remote, whether or not the vaccine mandate will apply to them. But if they're doing sales and working with customers or providing services at vendor sites, then you're probably going to have a situation where that vaccine mandate would apply to them, but not all. For employer mandate, an employer mandate that is both job related and consistent, can it be either job related or consistent with business necessity? Can it be either or? No, it's actually what EEOC says is it has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. But again, I think what you look now is the federal mandate doesn't really talk about that. It basically says if you've got 100 or more employees, they should be vaccinated unless they're exempt. So I wouldn't throw out the job related and consistent with business necessity that comes from EEOC, because that is still their guidance right now before the effective date of the president's mandate. But it could be that provides some cover for employers to get to have the mandate. And I'm trying to scroll down here for more questions. Here we are. Technology challenges. My kids, I'm sure, are rolling their eyes right now. Is 100 employees per location or total? I think we've addressed that. It's going to be as it is defined by the ETS, but it will likely be integrated and it'll probably be beyond one location. It probably not is. It's not all in one location. It'll likely be your total employees. Whatever formula is applied. Can employers pass the cost of testing on to the employee? No, in New Hampshire, the answer is no. That would be, it's a medical test, and I think that it would likely be employer covered cost. Because if OSHA does not stipulate that the employer has to pay. We do know right now that the guidance is going to be that the time taken to get the vaccine is considered to be hours worked under federal wage laws. That's to get the vaccine. But testing can you pass it along? In New Hampshire, the answer is no. I know the answer at this point, as we don't know, but hypothetically, will the onus for testing be on employee to get or for the employer to offer the testing? I think the answer will be, it should be if the person is exempt, medical or religious, and even if the person refuses, because that has to come out in the guidance as well as to whether or not they could be included in the opt-out. It should be the employer should require testing on a weekly basis. A lot of questions, the same question about whether or not how that 100 is counted. So I think we've covered that pretty effectively. We're a private company that we have contracts with the federal government. It's our main customer. We have over 100 employees and 95% of them work remotely across the country. Are we required to have everyone vaccinated? No option for negative test results. I think the answer is going to be, again, forget about the number. If you are considered to be a federal contractor, you're not going to have, federal employees, there is no opt-out. We're going to wait for the guidance to say whether or not federal contractors have no opt-out, or whether federal contractors go into the same bucket as private sector employers, and they have to have more than 100 employees. So we'll see. But I don't think so. I think it's going to be you're a federal contractor. And then the question is whether or not there is an opt-out like the private sector employers or no opt-out like the federal government employees. Don't know yet. We hope to see soon. And by the way, as Kelly mentioned, there's going to be a lot more coming out on this, and we're going to be doing more client alerts. We're going to be doing more webinars. In fact, I'm doing a presentation on this topic this afternoon with our folks at New Hampshire Public Broadcasting, and this Friday taping for Sunday show with WMUR New Hampshire Business with Fred Coker. And in that period of time between now and this afternoon or Friday, there will likely be more information, but certainly beyond that, we'll have more information as well. Another one, 78 employees in Mass, 35 in Florida, 25 in New York. Are we covered? Even though not the same location, I think the answer is yes, but we'll see. Public facilities. And that's the question under New Hampshire law with regard to the vaccine requirement. I assume government facilities, but not private businesses or restaurants, correct? Doesn't say that. It says a place of public accommodation for purchase of the benefits. Again, that's the freedom from vaccination under New Hampshire law. But that is not a well-developed law either. CDC states that 46% of all ages are not fully vaccinated. You stated the number is 33%. What is your source? Well, someone is challenging my data. The answer is it depends. It's over age 12 is what we're talking about. And I think that the way in which we should deal with that is look at the data from not only the CDC, but also from your state issues. But it depends upon the numbers you're talking about. Again, the federal government's saying between 80 and 100 million. If we've got a population of 325 million, you have to break it down to, okay, how many of those are over age 12 and otherwise could receive the vaccine? And that's where you basically extrapolate the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. Okay, we don't know full-time or part-time. That's another question that's come up. Is it rapid or PCR testing? Not clear yet. It just simply says testing. Although if you're looking at the access to pharmacies, that would be the test within would be PCR, which is in 24 to 72 hours for results. Who pays for the testing? Again, I think under New Hampshire law, it would be the employer. We have lots of questions, and this was anticipated. Is it appropriate for the employer to post a list of employees who are not vaccinated? Wow, I would say no. Talk about the scarlet letter. But the reality is, what you're going to have is a situation if someone's not vaccinated in the workplace, they're going to be wearing a mask, right? So you're already going to know. Now, it's true the vaccinated could wear a mask too. And in some workplaces, even our law firm, we set a requirement that even if you're vaccinated, if you travel in the common corridors or you're in someone's office and for longer than a few minutes, and whether they're vaccinated or not, we ask that you wear a mask. So you may, but I think posting is probably not a good idea. Again, you're going to keep that information, the vaccinated information and testing and so on, as a confidential medical record, and it should be on a need-to-know basis. So could your supervisors know for purposes of accommodation and so on? Perhaps. It's just like the ADA for purposes of first aid, but posting it, I think that's a bad idea. If someone refuses to get vaccinated, the companies stand to work for in the office. The company requires them to work in the office. Do we have the ability to term them? If the requirement is that they be in the office and there is no reasonable accommodation, I think then the answer is, yeah, termination. But as I said, termination should be a last option if at all possible. Is religious exemption by the employee a self-attestation? It is. It is a self-attestation, and it's under sincerely held religious belief, and the person signs off on the pains and penalty of perjury. Can you do a little bit more deep dive with regard to the nature of the religion? Yeah, but the question is, how much of an expert are you going to be? And you can look at it as whether or not it's a personal, a philosophical, or a political issue, or it's truly religious. Are there any New Hampshire laws or executive orders that could impact the president's recent executive order on this? I think the answer is, well, we do know about the New Hampshire law with regard to vaccination. We do know about the New Hampshire law with regard to medical testing, and also inquiries with regard to at the time of hire or otherwise with regard to medical conditions. But apart from that, there's necessarily no real opposition, except that one medical freedom law that says you cannot require vaccination as for purposes of gaining access to and the services and benefits of a place of public accommodation. So that could be something that stands in opposition. Can we require the employee to put their request for exemption and supporting documentation in writing? Absolutely. Absolutely. Otherwise, what record do you have? In fact, I would recommend, for purposes of the request for exemption and the supporting reasons, that you retain those, subject to, and whether you accept it or deny it, so subject to challenge later to show that you went through that interactive process. Under the path of the pandemic, has there been any discussion about the dollar threshold for private employers who receive some amount of federal? No, that hasn't come out yet, whether or not that it's a dollar amount for purposes of the receiving the whether or not they're considered to be a federal contractor and covered by the mandate. Right now, again, I think it's going to be, if you're a federal contractor, you should certainly be paying close attention to this, and then watch for a dollar threshold amount. What, if any, is a reasonable accommodation for a manufacturing environment that cannot be done remotely and requires close proximity. Don't know. It could be shift change. It could also be wearing enhanced PPE and so on. But I think the only other thing that comes up is, in addition to PPE, is if the person's exempt, medical or religious reasons, that you're doing opt-out, you're doing the testing as an alternative. Again, the question is whether or not, if religious and medical do not apply, can employers still do opt-out testing short of termination, along with PPE for those that simply refuse to get the vaccine? Again, the focus of this executive order is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. What about employers that have common ownership to represent 100 employees? I think that integrated standard is going to be for if you have common ownership and some degree of control, then you're likely to have been counted as 100 employees. But we're waiting for that test to come out because there are many different, well, there are several different tests out there. But I think you're likely going to be, if you're an integrated employer, I think you're likely to have be counted under the 100 employees. We have one employee choosing not to vaccinate. The 10 remaining employees are vaccinated. If we require all unvaccinated employees to mask and work from home, are we in danger of violating the privacy of the employees since you are the only person masking? Well, are they masking in the workplace and working from home, or what? I'm not clear about that. But again, you're going to have a segregation right now in the workplace where the unvaccinated largely will be wearing masks and the unvaccinated may or may not be wearing masks. But people talk, people have, whether they state their objection to the vaccine or otherwise, but people generally have a sense of who is vaccinated, who's not. That being said, the employer, meaning the HR person, should not be spreading that information if it's not otherwise known or if the employee doesn't disclose the information. The question just came up is, will federal contractors also have religious and disability exemptions available to them? I think the answer is yes. And the same is true for federal employees. However, there is no opt-out for testing. So the question is, can there still be a reasonable accommodation where that person can perform their job remotely? Again, this remains to be seen. Does the mandate apply to all employees of the company working on-site or remotely, especially if a remote employee comes on-site periodically? I think I answered that one, which is one, that the remote employee is counted in the head count probably. Two, if they are fully remote, you're probably not going to be required to have them vaccinated. However, if they travel for business or if they come into work occasionally, then they're likely to be required to be vaccinated unless an exemption applies and they could do testing. Are safe workplace guidelines, a guidance still in effect, such as social distancing, barriers, masks, cleaning, filtration, and so on? The answer is yes. That's the OSHA guidance that has not gone away with regard to COVID. Can we implement employer mandate now based upon the president's mandate? Yes, you can, and a lot of employers were doing that. But I still would do the exemptions for medical and religious reasons, and I would look at reasonable accommodations. If booster shots are all become a reality, will they likely be included as a part of the vaccine mandate? Don't know. Very good question. That's a question that we have as well, because right now it's fully vaccinated by X date. And the question is fully vaccinated include the booster shot, or will this be a rolling compliance? We are quasi-government. Do you think that we would fall under this mandate? The question is how it's going to be defined, whether or not, if you're quasi-government, if you're considered to be a public sector employer, and whether or not that's considered to be a definition within private employees, because again, what you had is federal employees, federal contractors, and private employers. And the question is, how do you define private employers? We don't know yet. Will employees have the option of vaccine or weekly testing? I think the answer is, for private sector employees, the answer is yes. The question ultimately is, though, this: are you going to have a situation where the person is refusing the mandate, refusing the vaccine, for personal reasons or for medical or religious reasons. And we don't know yet as to whether or not the person who simply refuses can also have the opt-out. We don't know yet. If use of at-home rapid tests are proliferate, won't positive cases be undercounted by the CDC moving forward? Good question. So that is certainly the case. And we've heard a lot of that going on for purposes of how that is properly recorded. And the question is whether or not, whether or not the at-home test is going to be acceptable to employers on that weekly testing, if that applies. Is a COVID test a medical test under New Hampshire law? While that is, we don't have the definitive answer. I think my conclusion is, and I think the conclusion of other members of our group is, yes, it likely would be. And therefore the employer, if the employer is requiring the employee as a condition of employment to get the test, and that the test be negative in order to return to work, then the answer is, I think the employer should pay for it. Can I ask an employee to provide proof of a positive test from that employee's family member? That's a curious question. So that would be if the employee is not coming to work because he or she claims that they are exposed to someone who has tested positive for COVID. That's a careful one because you're asking about someone who's not your employee providing information. I think what I would do in that case is I would talk to the healthcare provider, your healthcare provider, the employee's healthcare provider, to say that we believe that the employee has been exposed to someone who's tested positive for or is symptomatic of COVID, and therefore should isolate or quarantine until that person either clears the quarantine period or test negative themselves. So not asking about the family member, but just focusing on the employee. Good question. If mandated, must employees be provided with PTO to get vaccinated or to get tested? The answer is it's paid time off. And the question is whether or not it's from the employee's bank or from the employer providing that time off for the vaccination or to deal with side effects. So that's in the initial executive order. We don't know if it's going to be a tax credit or reimbursement from the feds, or if it's just out of the pockets of the employer, or if it comes from the employee's PTO. My suspicion is it's going to be just out of the employer's pocket. What about to get tested? Whether or not the time to, as we know, the time for the employee to get vaccinated and dealing with side effects is paid for by the employer. What about testing? The test is paid for. We don't know how the test is going to be paid for yet, but the time to get tested under New Hampshire law, we think that that would be considered to be hours worked and therefore compensable, not PTO, but compensable. Would we still be able to ask for documents that provide information on the employee's religious beliefs? Yeah, I would ask you, you're going to ask for a form and the person's going to sign under pains and penalty of perjury and identify that what they believe. And I've seen lots and lots of these. Again, some of them are cookie cutter and can be dismissed, but some of them truly are genuine, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to accept it or not as a sincerely held belief. But yes, require a document of some sort, at least from the employee. Our subcontractors direct to government contractors fall under the federal contractor mandate. We don't know yet, and that's a question that we've asked as well. And that's actually been asked of the president from some larger corporations too. For small businesses under 100 employees, can the employer still follow the mandate rules requiring the vaccine? The answer is yes. That predated the president's announcement, and that was something that EEOC said, yes, if it is, again, job-related and consistent with business necessity. Can you go over if there is a vaccine mandate and the employee refuses to get it or is exempt, and the last resort they are terminated, can the person get the unemployment benefits? Again, I think there's a distinction between if the person is exempt for medical or religious reasons, the standard for unemployment is I'm unemployed through no fault of my own. If the person says it's medical, well, clearly that's no fault of their own. they would probably get unemployment benefits. Religious, probably they'll get unemployment benefits. But if the person simply refuses, I just object to, I'm an anti-vaxxer, do I get the benefit? The question is, if it's a mandate and the employer says you've got the options of, and that's a question too, which would be testing and no testing. If the person says, I don't want to be tested either, then can the employer terminate? Yeah, the employer could terminate. And the question is, the standard is, did the employee know of the rule and know if he or she violated or didn't comply with the rule that he or she could be terminated? And if so, it could be misconduct associated with work, but that's up to the unemployment office to make that ultimate decision. But I think there's a distinction between the exemptions and a person simply refusing to get the benefit or complying with your safety guidelines. Can you require a negative test to return to work for an employee who tested positive for COVID? I think the answer is yes. And that predated this mandate. Can an employee refuse to work in the office and request ADA accommodation for full-time work due to risk of COVID if working in the office? That's one that has come along since last March. It was the fear of COVID, and we saw I can't come to work because I'm afraid of getting COVID. Well, unless you are completely insulated at home and not dealing with anybody else and interacting with any individual, and never going outside of your place, where you live, I think that issue's come up a lot. I mean, I think in the early days it was, I'm not coming back to work until there's a vaccine. And then I'm not coming back to work until the vaccine has been fully approved, of which now the Pfizer vaccine has. I'm not coming back to work because of the spike in infections. I think the real issue there is the person has to identify, I'm not coming back to work because I have these underlying health conditions. I have a compromised immune system and so on. But even then you say, well, like in my workplace, we're 97% vaccinated. So you've got greater risk out there than here. And even here you could wear PPE. But if you're looking at, indefinite remote work accommodations, for the most part, an indefinite accommodation is not something that employers have to adopt, because you look at the reasonable accommodation analysis, the cost and effect upon the organization. If the job requires that the person at least part-time come into work, then the person doesn't dictate. In fact, the person never dictates what the reasonable accommodation is. It's a back and forth. They can request and support it, but ultimately the employer decides. Does this apply to temporary workers? Would we count these as under the 100? We don't know yet. I think temporary probably won't be counted. The question is how long they're temps. But don't know whether that counts in the 100. Another question about temps. How would we handle temporary employees? Rely on the agencies to tell us if they're vaccinated or not? Good question. And that is something you can do now. You can ask them and you can ask for proof of vaccination. I'm going to wrap up with just a couple more questions, but because I'm reaching my 1 hour, my 9:30 time limit here, but let me just pick. Here's a quick question. If it takes 3 to 5 days, the PCR for test results, can they work in the meantime? Good question. I think the answer is, if you're talking about weekly testing and it takes 3 to 5 days, what are they doing? Are they working from home, or are they working in the office with PPE and so on? So we're going to have to wait to see for guidance on that one. We have at least 65 questions remaining in the queue, and I've run out of my time. But again, this afternoon, we've got a program we're taping for New Hampshire Public Television. On Friday, we're taping for Fred Coker's New Hampshire Business Show that will air twice on Sunday. We're coming out with more alerts. We have a published article in New Hampshire Business Review coming out. And we're also, of course, available for calls, emails, texts, and the like, and happy to answer your questions. So I hope that's been helpful today. I really appreciate you folks being here. Again, we had over 500 people registered, and most stayed throughout the entire program. Lots and lots of questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. I tried to talk fast and get to as many as I could, but I hope that's been helpful. Please stay tuned. There's going to be so much more on this, and we appreciate your attention. Thanks so much.